Fergal McNally didn't even finish the growing up stage, which understandably upset his sisters, Jackie and LaFay, and his brothers, Albion and Joshua, a.k.a. Albie and Josh, or the twins. And a significant number of people in this exploit don't reach the growing old stage. I'm sorry, but there it is. As I began by saying, some 351 words ago, first and foremost, this book is about death. In addition to death, you're also about to encounter a lot of rain. Like death, rain has its uses. Without rain, most, if not all, plant life would die. There'd be one long drought, and eventually all the animals and humans would die too. So, we should be offering a great big cheery thank you to our local rain gods, or to the god of everything, or to Mother Nature, or whichever, if any, deity handles these things. That doesn't mean to say we have to like rain. I'm glad we have electricity, it's very useful, but I don't particularly want to hug it. Hug a big piece of electricity and it'll burn you to a crisp. I like the different seasons. I like summer to be sunny and winter to be snowy. I like the crispy golden leaves of autumn and fresh green shoots of spring. I feel sorry for people who live in brilliant sunshine all year round. Boring. Rain plays its part in making the seasons individual. But the rain in this book is a merciless rain. It's torrential, which is why it comes down in torrents. And it's cold and seemingly never-ending. The night this particular unlikely exploit began, it was raining in Fishbone Forest. A forest that gets its name from the shape of its trees. Huge, pineless firs. They look like the skeletons of long-dead fishes, their noses to the ground. Wrought iron railings run all the way around the huge forest, with 4 great gateways, one at each of the 4 main points of the compass. The gates are always locked. These have always been a puzzle to the local people, who believe that no one in their right mind would want to go into the forest anyway. What they don't realize is that they're there to keep things in, not people out. And the rain? This was the kind of rain that would have to be painted with great slashes across a canvas with lashings of paint. This was the kind of rain that soaked your clothes into a soggy mass in under a minute and then continued to beat down on you. This was the kind of rain that made you think that it had something personal against you. It was through this downpour that an old van, the colour of English mustard, was driving up to the west gate of Fishbone Forest. At the wheel was a small man. He was a very small man. In fact, he was as small as the small masked burglar at the end of the first unlikely exploit. Okay, so he was the small masked burglar at the end of the first unlikely exploit. Which means the first time we met him, he was stealing a human brain in a jar of pickling vinegar from Sacred Heart Hospital. The small masked burglar was no longer masked, but he was still small, and did have a name. That name was Stephen Multichin, which sounds rather grand, but because he wasn't, everyone who knew him called him Mulch. The only time he was ever addressed as Mr. Multichin was when he was sent junk mail. Dear Mr. Multichin, you're already halfway toward winning the vacation of a lifetime. You're a guaranteed winner. Or when he was caught doing a burglary.
Stephen Multichin, we find you guilty of stealing the bag of newts from Wilf's Fish Emporium and sentence you to 2 weeks' hard labor and ban you from keeping amphibians for 6 months.
You get the picture. The human brain Mulch had stolen was still in its jar of pickling vinegar, now wrapped up in brown parcel paper, the good, thick stuff, and was sitting on the passenger seat beside him. Brains weren't usually kept in pickling vinegar at Sacred Heart. They were usually kept in formaldehyde, or a formaldehyde solution. But for reasons far too time-consuming to relate now, this particular brain ended up in pickling vinegar from nearby Ma's pickling store. The Ma in question was actually one Mrs. Edna Bloinstein, and, unusually for a Ma, I'd say, she'd never had any children. This particular brain belonged to Fergal McNally, whom I mentioned earlier. Well, The brain couldn't really belong to Fergal McNally because Fergal McNally was dead. What I meant to say was that it had been Fergal's brain. It was the brain of the dead Fergal. If you could see through the darkness, through the rain, through the side of the English mustard-coloured van, and through the brown parcel paper, the good thick stuff, you would see the word juvenile written on the label beneath Fergal's name. That's because Fergal was just a little kid when he fell out of a 14th-story window and landed splat on the pavement below. Of course, Fergal's family had no idea that Fergal's brain had been removed from his dead body, though it's standard procedure for a post-mortem, carried out to try to find the cause of death, let alone put in a jar of pickling vinegar, let alone stolen by mulch, wrapped in brown paper, and driven to the west gate of Fishbone Forest. In fact, the dead boy's 2 sisters, Jackie and Lefay, remember, and 2 twin brothers, Joshua and Albion, need I remind you, were, at that very moment, being driven home to their father to break the news of the terrible accident. Mulch drew the van to a halt and managed to struggle into a bright yellow plastic raincoat and matching hat before opening the door to the rain. The sound of the rain on the plastic sounded like he was being hit with a million tiny ping-pong balls, and the water ran off the brim of the hat like a waterfall. Mulch's hands were soaked as he produced a large, old-fashioned key from his pocket and put it in the lock of the gate. The mechanism was well oiled, and the key turned with ease. Mulch pulled both gates open wide, the rain splashing in his face, making it hard to see, and leapt back into the van. He drove into the forest, parked again, and dashed out to close and lock the west gate behind him. There was a flash of sheet lightning. In other words, not the forked lightning of horror movies, which often hits branches and sets them alight, but the type of lightning that seems to light up the whole sky with one bright flash. What very few people know, but you're about to be one of them, is that Fishbone Forest is not a natural forest. By that I mean, it was actually planted by a member of the ancient Lions family many hundreds of years ago, when they weren't quite so ancient, rather than having taken root naturally, like the ancient woodlands to the north. A grand house, Fishbone Hall, had been built in the middle, surrounded by an equally grand garden, with lakes and fountains and terraces and statues, with a forest surrounding that. Over time, people on the outside forgot about the house and garden on the inside and assumed that it was forest through and through. The house and garden were still there in the center, but could no longer be described as grand. Grotesque might be a better word for them, though somewhat harder to spell. The ornamental ponds had dried up, their fountains long since silent and still, and the lake was more foul-smelling thick green slime than water. The statues had crumbled, becoming faceless or even headless stone freaks. On the house itself, the house had become so overgrown with ivy, inside and out, that it looked more like some giant rock formation than a human-made structure. The whole place had a feeling of decay about it. It seemed unnatural. It seemed that the boundary of human-made and natural had somehow blurred. Some indefinable line had been crossed. There was something wrong at the very heart of Fishbone Forest. Lights shone from many of the glassless windows as Mulch drove up toward the hall, along a slippery path that wound like a great snake through the hideous, bone-like trees. At last, the path turned into a sweeping driveway, and Mulch steered the van through the neglected garden, past crumbling balustrades, ivy-choked statues, and weed-clogged flower beds of long-dead roses. He pulled the English mustard-coloured van to a halt, as near to a door at the side of the house as possible. Picking up Fergal's brain in the wrapped jar, he tucked it under his arm, opened the driver's door, and made the short dash from the vehicle to the dryness of the house. He stood in the bright light of the kitchen, rain dripping from his yellow plastic raincoat and hat. "Any luck?" asked a bored-looking teenage boy who'd obviously only recently got in from the rain himself and was drying his clothes in front of a roaring open fire. He was wearing an old blue terry-cloth bathrobe. "Yep," Mulch nodded, putting the